if you do not want to be recorded, you can leave. Otherwise, we're recording.
Of course, what we're going to do with the recording later is still up for grabs. Okay, welcome everybody. We're talking about a hot topic tonight in O'Connor Studies, and before we get to that, I want to make some announcements about upcoming events here and there. My Flannery O'Connor Book Club meets at 7 o'clock on Thursday, February 25th to finish The Habit of Being, to have the discussion about the final pages of Flannery O'Connor's letters, pages 503 to 596. Feel free to join us. And what then? Our final NEH results presentation of the semester will take place on Thursday, May the 9th, 7 p.m. when Ashley Massey, I see her there, and Tim Vanderbeek, who I think is going to be joining us tonight, are going to be talking about Flannery O'Connor and Andalusia Farm. I'll send out announcements about the May events around May the 1st, reminders of this. I just got information from the folks at Emory that they're going to do I believe, free screening of Wildcat at Emory on May the 10th. With Ethan and Maya Hawk in attendance. And after the screening, they're going to have Rosemary McGee and Amy Altsnauer talking about this and that, having to do with the film, and I suppose the big library exhibit at Emory. Let's see, am I forgetting something? How many announcements was that? And anybody who's close by, we're going to have a reading, poetry reading at Blackbird Coffee Shop on Tuesday, May the 14th. Laura Newbern of the Georgia College Creative Writing Program and Alice Fryman reading from their new books, 5:30 to 6:30. Okay, I guess that's all of my announcements. We will continue with these presentations, these Zooms. Don't we all just love Zooms in the fall? You know, people want to make suggestions about what we ought to do. Hey, send me an email. And oh, by the way, I forgot. Here's the thing I forgot. May the 15th is the deadline for proposals for paper presentations at the conference. I spent the whole day on the conference, and I'm still accepting proposals for Flannery O'Connor Second Century, Looking Forward, Looking Back, our conference to be held September 12th to the 15th this fall. I brought this flyer to remind me, and also to remind me to say that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed at this event tonight do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Seems like the right time to make a disclaimer. Okay, introductions. You may have read these introductions already, but we're taping. Okay, our first speaker is William Gonch. He's an assistant professor of literature and director of the literature program at Ave Maria University. A scholar of 20th and 21st century American literature, he conducts research on the creative exchange, the translation between secular and religious styles and modes of imagination. He holds a PhD in literature from the University of Maryland, and he served as the Cornerstone Fellow in English at the Catholic University of America. Next up will be Bryant Cheney. He's assistant director. Here's the title. Can you get this on a business card? He's assistant director for faculty development, community engagement, and research at the University of Tennessee's Judith Anderson Herbert Writing Center. Wow. He holds a PhD in English from the University of Kentucky. His scholarship and teaching focus on community engaged pedagogy, 20th century U.S. literature, Southern and Appalachian literatures, and most recently, the rise of artificial intelligence in writing classrooms. President of the Flannery O'Connor Society since 2021, Cheney has published on O'Connor in the Georgia Review and the Rutledge Companion to Literature of the U.S. South, and he has work forthcoming in the Flannery O'Connor Review. With Anthony Seschel, Cheney is co-editor of Reckoning with Racism and Flannery O'Connor, which is currently accepting proposals through July 2024, with the University of Georgia Press having agreed to review the manuscript for publication. Will Murray, our third speaker, is an assistant professor of English at Tennessee Wesleyan University. His research and published work focus on questions of race and region in post-1960s American literature, film, and television. Examples of Murray's work can be found in American Studies, Mississippi Quarterly, and the Eudora Welty Review. His book Dangerous Innocence, White Men, Mass Culture, and the Southern Outsiders Appeal, 1960 to 2020, is out right this minute from LSU Press. I'm going to ask each of our three speakers to talk for 10 to 15 minutes about the subject using whatever angle on it they want to take, and then we will have questions and comments. Okay, let's go. Bill Gonch, you're up first.
All right, Bruce, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. Matt, Will, I'm looking forward to a great conversation. It's really nice to be back with so many NEH Georgia folks. This is a lot of fun. So I'm going to dive right in and then look forward to discussing with all of you. So today, I want to explore a persistent discomfort about O'Connor's representations of race and the Jim Crow South's racial caste system, which is her use of what I call a racial grotesque, something that invokes a racist social order, figures it as evil, subjects it to critique, while at the same time, as with much of O'Connor's grotesque, using it as a broken image that points towards a theological whole. I propose the racial grotesque as a way to resolve certain disputes over O'Connor's representation of race. But first, I want to talk a little bit about those disputes. There are a number of critics, as probably a lot of people know, that have charged O'Connor with using theology as an excuse to dodge political and especially racial concerns. As Timothy Caron puts the charge, O'Connor's stories are, quote, more concerned with maintaining the various racial categories and socioeconomic levels of traditional white Southern culture than they are with the, quote, salvational concerns to which O'Connor pointed in her essays. There are many variants of this charge, but nearly all of them point to one or both of a couple of qualities: the reduction of Black characters to, quote, spiritual catalysts, for white characters' conversions, and the depiction of salvation as a reinscription of a white-dominated social order. In response, other critics have pointed to the ways in which O'Connor stories depict, critically and with great astuteness, the very white exploitation, both psychological and material, of those African-American characters. As Doreen Fowler puts it in a thoughtful essay, it's not that O'Connor's stories exploit Blackness, but that, quote, her literary agenda is to explore the ways whites make use of Blackness. To Caron's charge that O'Connor's short stories, quote, reveal the white South's apprehension over the slow but steady dissolution of the color line, end quote, Fowler and other critics of this mode replied, well, yes, they do. But that reading mistakenly collapses O'Connor's perspective into the perspectives that her characters express. O'Connor's stories don't reinscribe white supremacy on this reading. They are about the desperate and failing attempts of whites in the 1950s and 60s to reinscribe that social order which once gave them power. Such readings, this second class of readings, point to those moments of grace which represent salvation through the collapse of hierarchies and interpersonal boundaries, especially in several key stories, racial ones. I find Fowler's reading compelling, but not exhaustive, because it doesn't quite account for the way in which even these failing racist social orders in O'Connor point to an ideal of community and communion that characters can only reach through the collapse of those orders. To explain what I mean, I want to turn to O'Connor's late story, Judgment Day. I'll speed through this a little bit because looking at the community we have, it looks like people know the story. We have a lot of people who know O'Connor well. So we're all familiar with the sort of core structure of this story. Tanner, old white man from Alabama, living with his daughter in New York City, longing for Alabama, for the home where he understood how to navigate the world, but especially where he, quote, was somebody, which the story shows quite clearly means to be somebody there means to be white in a society of this racial caste system that gave his white skin power and importance. It describes his relationship with Coleman Parham and unpacks the way in which that relationship is premised on exploitation. Then in the story's present in New York City, Tanner meets his Black neighbor, an actor who reminds him of home and of Coleman. And in that, invokes a sort of longing in Tanner that makes him think he can recognize the man, but of course fail to recognize him, ultimately invoking a set of social codes from the Old South that threatens and angers the man and sort of works the man up to assault him, leads to his death. Thus, in both sequences, the narrative calls attention to the racial exploitation that Tanner assumes and that underlie his search for what he takes to be salvation, that is, returning home. The story invokes his longing to return to a world that he understands, while remaining ruthlessly clear-eyed about the ways in which his longing is implicated in that racist social order. That longing, then, is the figure of the pride and defensiveness that's shattered by O'Connor's characteristically violent grace. Like many O'Connor stories, Judgment Day turns on a disjunction between the character's understanding of key terms and those terms' allegorical meaning. Specifically, the story invokes two forms of salvation and two meanings of home. As Tanner understands the term, home is the Alabama of 30 years earlier, with its Jim Crow laws and elaborate manners, to use O'Connor's term, by which whites exploit their Black neighbors. Tanner believes he's inhabiting the story, then, that O'Connor's critics charge her with telling. The first group of critics. He seeks the, quote, heaven of clear-cut racial categories, that's another Karen line, that Karen charged O'Connor with representing, and he views both Coleman and his new neighbor in the way that Catherine Brown accused O'Connor of viewing African Americans, quote, primarily as the signifiers through which white Southern identity was constructed. As Fowler puts it, when Tanner says, help me up, preacher, I'm on my way home, he looks to this Black man to confer everlasting life by serving as a substitute sacrifice in a drama of redemption that figures the Old South as redemption. But his attempt to live that story and return to that home quite literally destroys him. In this way, I'd argue, Judgment Day is a kind of parody of the readings that first class of O'Connor's readings that O'Connor's critics charge her with. However, and here is where the persistent discomfort comes in, and I think the discomfort that same first group of critics are responding to and productively exploring, Tanner's Alabama does, in this story, point to the real heaven that Tanner is unknowingly seeking. 1930s Alabama becomes an example of the grotesque that our own Bruce Gentry described as a degraded ideal that, through its degradation, nevertheless invokes and points towards the true thing, of which it's a corruption. Tanner, looking for his true home in Alabama, is brought by the violent ministry of his Black neighbor, whom he mistakenly calls preacher, to his true home in heaven. The actor does play a role in a drama of sacrifice, just not the drama that Tanner imagines he's living. Tanner's longing for Alabama, and therefore for the racist social order of his youth, as twisted as it is used in the story to figure a longing for heaven, which is satisfied. As in many O'Connor stories, violence humbles a character and becomes a vehicle for the grace, a vehicle of the grace that character has unknowingly been seeking by redirecting his desires from his earthly goals to the true heavenly one, of which they are a broken representation. Thus, Judgment Day, in my reading, does not ask its readers to see Alabama as a type of heaven, but it does ask us to see its perversions of justice as capable of invoking heaven by, in a sense, by their negation, by its own failure to be the home that Tanner is looking for. And it asks them to see in his search, as grotesquely corrupted as it may be, the glimmer of a desire for a true home. In this way, O'Connor works with racism in the same way that she works in other stories with other forms of sin and violence, as grotesque parodies that nevertheless, usually unwittingly, are turned by God's grace to testify to the true thing. So I don't think that it's right to charge O'Connor with either of the charges laid out in the beginning, with exploiting Black characters for white salvation, or endorsing their longing for a vanishing racist self. Both qualities, in my reading, pretty consistently appear as sins from which violent grace breaks them. However, she is willing to use those fallen, violent, sinful social orders to represent, to figure God's grace through broken instruments. It turns them into a kind of symbol and reverse of the thing that they're meant to be representing by their failure to embody it. Jim Crow Alabama, and Tanner's longing for it, then this is why I'm calling it a racial grotesque. They point towards the very love and community that they have failed to achieve. And I think it's likely to remain uncomfortable to dwell on that ambiguity and O'Connor's choice to doubly signify in that way. Thank you very much. I think Matt's up.
Matt, you're up. And I didn't put in his introduction that he's a musician too. I should have worked that in. Yeah.
Well, great job, Bill. Thank you so much for that talk. And hope I can live up to that example, man. That was really good. I just want to express gratitude to the NEH Summer Institute, particularly Bob and Bruce for all the work you all did and all the organizing and keeping us all aware of everything and, in contact with one another. Really excited to be here tonight with my colleagues, Will Murray and Bill Gonch, who I really just love and appreciate so much. And this is just really special for me to be here and be able to do this. And also want to thank the Flannery O'Connor Institute and Tammy Burke and Jordan Kofer and everybody there and all the good work y'all are doing at GCSU. I couldn't really come up with a title for this. Some of y'all who were at the Summer Institute will recognize some of what I'm about to say, but it's a little bit reworked and rethought. And y'all know I can talk forever, so I'm going to put a timer up here off camera so that I don't go nuts. All right. So I'll speak at the beginning, and then I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, just to show y'all some quotations, because some of them are a little long. And I will not be sharing the story from the Violent Buried Away manuscript that I shared the last time I gave a talk like this. So those of y'all who are looking forward to that can just wait a little bit longer. Sorry. So I want to start by acknowledging a fact about this session, that there are limits to perspectives that can be expressed regarding O'Connor and race when the panelists are all white men. In naming this moment, I'm reminded of Patricia West's very accurate indictment of O'Connor studies during our question and answer session at the 2021 ALA Symposium on O'Connor in Savannah, in which a panel of 5 white scholars responded to the renewed debates about O'Connor's racism, which surfaced in 2020, most notably in the very heated online debate between Angela Elema O'Donnell and Paul Eli. By acknowledging the limitations of mine and my colleagues' perspectives, even though they're brilliant men and they have incredible things to say, by acknowledging those limitations, my fear is that for some listeners, I will been labeled a kind of woke virtue signaler, someone perhaps dead set on canceling Flannery O'Connor in order to make sure that everyone knows that I'm not as racist as she was. And if that were my goal, I hope I would have had enough integrity to politely decline Bruce's invitation. I do not wish to imply that white scholars shouldn't talk about O'Connor and race, that we should only take seriously what scholars of color have to say about O'Connor. Indeed, to do so would be mistaken in at least two ways. It would imply that scholars of color are solely responsible for discussing the racism of white writers, that they should spend more of their time explaining why white writers do or do not engage well with race at the expense of other topics they might find more interesting or fulfilling or important. And the second mistake is it would reinforce a harmful belief that white scholars do not have to contend with race in their work. As has been noted by many writers trying to better understand race and racism in America, the belief that one does not have to think about their race is, to use one now maligned term, an incredibly privileged position. No, we need to talk about O'Connor and racism, because to do so, I know this sounds a little cliche, but I believe this. To do so is to start to talk about ourselves and racism. And as has been the case in 60 plus years of scholarship on O'Connor, many hours and debate and discussion with my NEH Summer Institute colleagues last June did not yield anything approaching a consensus on the question of O'Connor and race. To slightly alter an unfortunate quote from O'Connor regarding James Baldwin, I think it more likely that a mule will fly than for O'Connor scholars to agree on racism in Flannery O'Connor. But for myself, that month of closely reading O'Connor in Georgia was transformative on this question. We began with Sandra Jones telling us about the history of segregation and resilience of Black Milledgevillians, if I'm saying that correctly, Milledgevillians. And listening to Sandra's stories, I was reminded of O'Connor's famous quote in a letter to Betty Hester: "The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally." Sitting and listening to Miss Jones in Allen's Market, it was refreshing to hear someone express a less heliocentric view of Milledgeville as just, quote, the place Flannery O'Connor was from, end quote. In their introduction to Faulkner in the Black Literatures of the Americas, Jay Watson and James G. Thomas Jr. warned against the impulse to rest all comparative analysis on a, quote, compelling but also admittedly limiting question of influence. Instead, Watson and Thomas Jr. argue for analyses of Faulkner and Black writers that, quote, explore the confluences between Faulkner's writings and Black writing in the Americas, the common questions framed within those bodies of work, the responses to common problems, precursors, and events. I would argue that the same kind of framework can help chart a path forward in O'Connor studies toward more generative engagements with Black writers and the troubling and hilarious writer from Georgia whose work continues to bring us together in spaces like these. As such, I have no interest in claiming that, for example, Toni Morrison's magisterial career was overwhelmingly indebted to Flannery O'Connor, or that by associating two authors such as them, we might ameliorate O'Connor's sordid and complicated record on race. But I would argue that by exploring, for example, Toni Morrison and O'Connor's common aesthetic choices and impulses, surprising connections emerge that can help us better engage with under-discussed aspects of both writers. And so I'll talk a little bit about Toni Morrison and O'Connor now. Toni Morrison and Flannery O'Connor were born only 6 years apart. While she was growing up in Lorain, Ohio, Morrison's father, George Wofford, worked as a sharecropper and a welder for U.S. Steel. He had moved north from his hometown of Cartersville, Georgia, just a few miles up the road from Milledgeville. That's where Morrison's father was from, some years earlier. When Flannery O'Connor was graduating from Peabody High School in Milledgeville, Toni Morrison was attending Hawthorne Junior High in Lorain and in the process of converting to Catholicism. At her confirmation, Chloe Wofford, as she was called as a child, took the name Anthony for St. Anthony of Padua, and her friends gave her the nickname Toni soon after. While Morrison was an English major at Howard University, the recently MFA'd Flannery O'Connor was adjusting to her new life on the family dairy farm back home in Milledgeville, following her devastating and painful lupus diagnosis. O'Connor's first novel, Wise Blood, was published in 1952 at the end of Morrison's junior year at Howard University. After writing an MA thesis on Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner at Cornell, Morrison, by then a single mother to her son Ford and pregnant with her son Slade, joined the editorial team at Random House in 1964, just a few months after O'Connor's death. Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970. In 1972, O'Connor's The Complete Stories received a posthumous National Book Award just a year before Morrison's second novel, Sula, was a finalist in 1973. During Morrison's literary education, O'Connor was a rising star. And while the elder writer maintained a more traditional and Orthodox Catholic faith inherited from her family, both women were Catholics who relished in mystery and whose vision continually held space for the supernatural, divine, demonic, or otherwise. Okay, so now I am going to attempt to switch over to my PowerPoint. So just bear with me for just a moment. Okay. Let's say, is there, whoever's the host, could y'all allow me to screen share if that's okay? If not, I can just throw these in the chat, whatever's easiest.
I got it.
Thanks, Jordan. So my goal is just to make sure Will has no time to talk. So y'all could just go read his book and buy it. So, okay, let's try this again. I'm just kidding. We need Will to talk. At least I need Will to talk. Okay. All right. Can y'all see that? All right, cool. All right. So let's go to slideshow. All right. Oh boy. Okay. All right. Having heard me read this last paragraph, you may understand the pause I felt when I read the following passage from Thaddeus Davis's article, Sites of Remembering and Forgetting on Anti-Racism. Critics generally observe how majority writers contribute to the work of minority authors. Rarely is there a mention of the reverse. How often are students of literature reminded that Toni Morrison wrote her master's thesis on William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf, yet are they routinely told of the white writers who found their inspiration in Morrison's works? By contrast, Davis goes on to say, if white people can enter the space of anti-racism, then they can leave behind the white space of forgetting and with it aspects of power and privilege that make possible the obscuring and distortion of racial others, quote unquote. African Americans, given the history of enslavement and long struggles against racial discrimination, often bear the brunt of the teaching of what it means to be anti-racist in the context of their experiences with race in the United States and the wider world. The concepts of remembering and forgetting allow for a language to articulate and think through how racism manifests. Sorry, one second. There we go. Itself at the center of the dearth of acknowledgement of the influence of Black writers, not merely on Faulkner, but also on other majority and minority writers, and ultimately on aesthetic and cultural production in the United States. Okay. So reading this paragraph from Dr. Davis, I was reminded of Alice Walker's lament in Beyond the Peacock, which is, I think, a probably underquoted section of Walker's essay, to be honest. I was reminded of this lament, responding to her mother's claim that, quote, nobody can change the past. Walker says, what comes close to being unbearable is that I know how damaging to my own psyche such injustice is. In an unjust society, the soul of the sensitive person is in danger of deformity from just such weights as this. For a long time, I will feel Faulkner's house, O'Connor's house, crushing me. To fight back will require a certain amount of energy better used doing something else. Reading both Walker and Davis in the context of O'Connor scholarship, I have come to the conclusion, go back to just me now, I've come to the conclusion that comparing O'Connor and Morrison's work in the way I was doing obscures an opportunity to more straightforwardly enter a space of remembering that may catalyze a necessary confrontation with Flannery O'Connor's racism, both privately and in her stories. And the good news is that in my readings back in the NEH Summer Institute, I found engaging discussions of O'Connor and Toni Morrison by David Weiner, Farrell O'Gorman, Allison Arendt, Doreen Fowler, and Angela Alema O'Donnell. Amy Altsnauer even gave Morrison a shout out in her presentation at Emory a couple of weeks ago, using some of the same things I would have mentioned if I were to have continued thinking about Morrison and O'Connor. Sometimes in our profession, it's important to recognize when our own interests may not be as novel or helpful as we think. I was grateful to have the dedicated time last June to read the long history of work on O'Connor and race that even predated 2020 when Angela published her first book-length study of O'Connor and race. Every single issue of the Flannery O'Connor Review, and it's accurate for me to say this, for the past decade has included at least some discussion of race. Every single issue has mentioned it or talked about it in some way, including essays like Miscegenation and Communism and Flannery O'Connor's The Displaced Person by Virginia Grant, and Bob Donohue's Recasting the Monuments, O'Connor and the Histories of the South. That was both in 2013. Patricia Ann West, who I gave a shout out at the beginning of the talk, she wrote an article in 2020 for Women's Studies called Every Eye Shut, Ain't Asleep, A Critical Race Awakening of Flannery O'Connor's Artificial and Converged Characters in Crisis, which offers a helpful discussion of the way scholars could benefit from a more sustained and critically inflected reading of racism in O'Connor. Having taught for over 3 decades on the predominantly Black Savannah State campus, West helpfully mixes her understanding of Gullah Geechee rhetorical tradition with a harrowing insistence that we need the much maligned strategies of critical race theory in order to, quote, create a more inclusive conversation in O'Connor studies. Keeping in mind Davis and Walker's weariness over the intellectual and emotional labor of constantly explaining racism to white scholars, it's been a long time since I appreciated an essay as much as I do Patricia West's. What now? Okay, so I'll just now gesture toward a couple of things that we're working on. In the chat, I'm about to drop a link to a couple of things. One is the call for proposals for a book that I am co-editing with Tony Sechel, called Reckoning with Racism and Flannery O'Connor. See a couple of our contributors on the call, so thank you all for being here tonight. Good to see everybody. And the second is a link to a Google Drive folder that I've been working on, populating with PDFs of articles on O'Connor and race, just to make sure folks have access to things that are underquoted or maybe not as widely read. And so if you have articles that don't appear there, please feel free to shoot them to me, and I'll put it there. And I am also working on an essay on Joel Chandler Harris and the Uncle Remus Tales and Song of the South later as being a really important formative influence on O'Connor's views of race, which has all sorts of pieces to it. So thank you all for listening. And I'm going to now call up the man, the myth, the legend, recently with his book, Dangerous Innocence, Will Murray, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. And want to echo what Matt said, thanking our host and Bill and Matt. It's great to be back with y'all and to rehash some of the conversations that we had summer. I'm gonna read, if that's okay, and I think it ties into some of the stuff that both Bill and Matt were talking about. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation as well afterwards. I think as O'Connor scholars, we need to be unequivocal in our willingness to admit and address what are clear racial failures on the part of O'Connor. And I think we need to acknowledge that those failures go beyond her letters. I believe then the more pressing question for those considering O'Connor's place in the classroom and larger literary culture is not the one that Paul Ely asked in the New Yorker, which is how racist was Flannery O'Connor. I think if we're honest, the verdict on that seems pretty clear. Instead, I think we should be asking, how does her racism impact her work and our enjoyment or use of it? In other words, knowing she held explicitly racist views, why would we still want to read and teach her fiction? When I ask people that question, I've mainly been met with 2 answers. First, we shouldn't. be teaching her fiction because it's racist and there's too much other good stuff out there. Or second, and more commonly, that her insights into religion or the nature of truth, Southern manners, etc., outweigh any unsavory elements of her work. Therefore, she should be taught with maybe a brief disclaimer about her being a product of her time. This latter answer is also often accompanied by a long defense of her as not that racist. And I think there are a great many problems to this defense, some of which I will try to articulate. However, I'm also convinced that acknowledging O'Connor as a white writer who is writing literature for white people, we can actually use her work to reveal important insights into the realities of race in America. Indeed, if O'Connor's work says anything interesting or useful at all about race, it has far more to do with what she reveals about whiteness, rather than any kind of insights into the minds of Black characters or their racial realities. So what do I think she says about whiteness? Primarily, I think she demonstrates the terror white people feel when they begin to confront the extent to which racial violence in the United States permeates the environment and implicates all of us. For O'Connor, I think she recognizes this violence on some level, but struggles to imagine what racial justice would look like. Her work then protects the racial status quo and ultimately her own position within the communal hierarchy. I think we can see her pushing back against the work being done by the civil rights movement in several places. But I think we see this maybe most clearly by looking at The Geranium, published in 1946, and Judgment Day, published in 1964. These stories largely share the same plot, which most of you are familiar with. An old Southern man moves to the city to live with his daughter. While there, he encounters a Black neighbor, acts like a racist, and suffers as a result. Since they share a plot and bookend O'Connor's writing career, they are often read together to demonstrate her growth as a writer and as a thinker. And to be clear, I agree with most critics that Judgment Day is a more developed and complex story, certainly as far as technique is concerned. However, despite her advancement as a writer, I'm also convinced that it is deeply misguided to read these two stories as evidence of O'Connor's growth in regard to her treatment of Black characters or her views on race more generally. First, The Geranium in many ways deals with familiar themes that would reverberate in O'Connor's later fiction. As Ralph Wood points out in 1978, we see in The Geranium a typical arrangement where an arrogant character suffers a harrowing encounter with their own presumption. However, beyond that basic framing, I see The Geranium very differently than Wood does. According to his argument, Judgment Day works as a corrective to this story, as an exciting window into what would have been a fruitful transition in O'Connor's fiction if she had only lived longer. As he writes, The Geranium is a rather sentimental and moralistic allegory, while Judgment Day is a penetrating piece of art. Wood goes on to argue that The Geranium only delivers a sense of moral smugness and artistic crudity, which are utterly uncharacteristic of the mature O'Connor. In defending the superiority of Judgment Day, he argues the later story offers enhanced moral complexity because both Blacks and whites are found equally wanting in the presence of grace, which makes mere racial tolerance seem by comparison something banal and unworthy. What Wood characterizes as banal and unworthy, though, is O'Connor expressing a much clearer understanding of what Richard Wright argued, that there isn't any Black problem in the United States, only a white one. In other words, what O'Connor seems to understand early in her career and abandons later is that Black people, if they had an opportunity, were fully capable of leading the way forward. The Black man in The Geranium, in fact, is the only somewhat developed person of color in O'Connor's fiction who seems capable of this work. We see him exhibit grace and charity without giving up his own sense of personhood and independence as he patiently guides the old white man named Dudley up the stairs. While aiding the old man, he also shares his knowledge about firearms, essentially proving his at least equal manhood. In other words, in The Geranium, there is a clear sense that Dudley's unwillingness to see Black people as equals is wrong. And recognizing equality is a low bar, but at least this story seems to correctly condemn white people resisting Black people's claim for equal treatment. There seems then to be some clear acknowledgement on O'Connor's part that dominant views on race were not only misguided and wrong, but also that white people were degrading themselves in their commitment to these views. Dudley, after all, is a pathetic character made significantly worse through resisting the obvious goodness of his neighbor. In contrast, Judgment Day, like a lot of O'Connor's stories, doesn't seem to have any admirable characters at all, which at first may seem like an equitable position aided by a Christian belief in something like our mutually fallen nature. However, this move toward original sin as a leveling mechanism, wherein we should applaud O'Connor for making her Black and white characters equally distasteful, seems entirely out of touch with racial realities in mid-century America. But again, the spiritualized pox on other houses attitude O'Connor exhibits in stories like Judgment Day almost explicitly creates a more leveling between Black people who were fighting for human dignity and white people who were fighting against granting them that dignity. Indeed, this view seems like a dangerous version of both siderism and inversion of Donald Trump's comment that there were very fine people on both sides of the Charlottesville protest. Moreover, I'm not sure that Judgment Day actually creates a level playing field with very bad people on both sides. Instead, the white character, Tanner, is deeply sympathetic, a tragic character. Readers are given a great deal of his perspective and shown how much he depends and cares for the Black man who he has left in the South. Yes, he is racist, but O'Connor places that racism as something born from a perverted love. Therefore, his brutal punishment at the hands of the Black actor, who sports a devilish goatee and horn-rimmed glasses, feels incredibly punitive and unnecessary. He is left dead, captured in symbolic stocks, shoved through the banister, and readers cannot help but feel that there's some cruelty in his positioning. In other words, the reader's sympathies are moved from the Black character on the stairs in the geranium to the white character Tanner in Judgment Day. What I think Judgment Day shows then is how O'Connor, like many white people before and after her, uses ugly images of Blackness to justify or at least make more sympathetic the claims white people were making about the need to go slow in areas of racial reckoning. After all, if Black people truly are murderous, greedy, and animalistic, as they are described in Judgment Day, then the go slow claims are justified. According to this framing, Black people in power would be terrifying, and their rule would almost certainly be violent and punishing. O'Connor, though, on some level seems to recognize how eventually white-authored racial violence married to dog-eat-dog capitalism will corrupt and consume everyone. This is the price of the ticket that James Baldwin writes about. As he puts it, in white people's debasement and definition of Black people, they debased and defamed themselves and have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion because they think they are white. While most white authors of O'Connor's period are guilty of Baldwin's later indictment, that white people refuse to be tormented by the suspicion that all men are brothers, I think O'Connor is clearly tormented by that reality. The fact that she can't get past this torment and admit the superior moral position of her brothers in the civil rights movement is a powerful testament of how hard it is to die to one's own interest and to truly enact an equitable vision of the world. The fact that she wrote some of her most hateful words about Black people in 1964, the year she died, also serves as an important reminder that racial progress is not achieved through simply the passing of time. Indeed, what I think O'Connor's fiction can show us clearly is how we can recognize the terrible implications of our racial and political commitments and still pursue our own perceived interests, even when it is abundantly clear that the violence those interests protect will only lead to more violence. Thank you. That's that.
Okay. Thank you all. We still have 14 minutes. And I will ask you to put your comments in the, or questions in the chat, or wave, raise your hand. Yeah, I was just about to say that Bryant Cheney is going to put together a panel for our September conference And so if you would like to be involved in it or panels, we can have Matt just chair session after session after session. Contact him and, you know, let him know what you're interested in doing here. I see Craig Martell's hand. Unmute. You're still, oh, there you go.
There you go. Hey, great to see all of the porch mates from NEH. And great content, guys. Just a quick question that's really for Will. You're quoting Ralph or referring to our friend Ralph C. Woods. Are you using his book, Flannery and the Christ-Haunted South, or his article From Fashionable Tolerance to Unfashionable Redemption, or both? Just curious.
It's the early one, fashionable tolerance. That one. Mhm.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm scanning. Well, Heidi, you want to ask your question?
Sure. This is a librarian question, so I apologize, but just curious what sources you're using to discern Flannery's feelings on race, trying to kind of hear it straight from her. Obviously, we've studied the letters to hear some of that, but there are other sources that come directly from her, like the transcripts of some of the interviews that she had that were published in, little known regional periodicals, that sort of thing. She does tackle race in those as well. So just curious what you're using for that. And then also knowing, as we are, the new letters that might be coming out with the changes to her estate. I know, Bruce, we've talked about that and are shuddering a bit with the ellipses points that Sally left in Habit of Being.
Right. Well, and Farrell is on the call, so if anybody has a letter they want published, I imagine that you could just shoot him a private.
Yes, he'll just
Private. Is that right, Farrell? They could just send you. Sorry, I'm being really I shouldn't be punchy and glib about these things. Just giving you a hard time, man. So in terms of what sources, yeah, that was one sort of fear I had with my talk, was that I didn't really delve into stories as much as Will and Bill did. I was a little bit more kind of 10,000 feet talking about the field, talking and kind of swooping down to look at various things. So what I would say is that I think we need to look at both things. I think we need to look at her published fiction and then also her private writing. We can argue about this. People argue about the death of the author or things like that. But I just think if have a conception of the author in your mind, you bring that conception when you come to read the fiction. And it's just sort of inseparable. A lot of people would disagree with that, but that's kind of where I come from on it. And yeah, there are things that I definitely saw in the archive that are not published, that I think are even more troubling than some of the other things that have come out. But I think a lot of the most sort of racist comments, were really only made available publicly in 2020. So I think that a lot of the sort of critiques in 2020 coming from radical ambivalence and Paul Eli's use of those quotations that Angela was able to put in her book. Sort of the knee-jerk initial reactions came from that. At least for me, I can't speak for Bill and Will, but that I sort of draw from lots of different things, including some of the letters. But when I'm talking about the stories, I do try to not use the letters to read the fiction as much as possible. So you can see I'm a little bit confused and conflicted on this, right? It's not a simple answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my answer is similar. I found that the letters deeply troubling. And I also found it deeply troubling this sort of complete lack of interest in Black authors. That we looked for evidence that she was reading Ralph Ellison or Richard Wright or somebody, that she was sort of trying to figure out how her Black characters would be thinking, and we couldn't find any evidence that she was curious about the inner workings of Black people. And that to me seems like an indication of what I was talking about earlier, an indication of why I think so few Black scholars are interested in O'Connor oftentimes, is because I don't think she says very much interesting about Black people. I think she says a lot of very interesting things about white people and the way that we consume fiction and what we enjoy and what we want to enjoy. But I also was sort of more than willing to put that aside and look at the art on its own, to try to separate those two things. I mean, I do believe most of us that are teaching her work. That's what we bring into the classroom. That's what we're putting in front of students. And I'm willing to sort of let the art work on its own, stand on its own. But what he found was just sort of a lot of echoes of that same sort of lack of curiosity and that same sort of skepticism about the civil rights movement as being something that was that she would support.
Yeah, if I could jump in and add to that, I take a similar approach. I think you find the material in the letters, but I tend to take a story first approach, certainly to teaching, but also to thinking about O'Connor more generally. Somewhat related to, I think, something you said in your talk, Will, I've been sort of moving more towards greater sympathy to Angela's stories versus the letters, or stories over a version of the stories over the letters approach, not as a framework for studying or understanding O'Connor and how she thought, which I don't think is how Angela meant it anyway. But I think, Will, you were gesturing towards O'Connor's sort of struggling attempts to recognize her own limitations and her own failure to understand her Black neighbors. And I think you see that dramatized in the story, in the stories. You can sort of see her struggling attempts to look beyond her own limitations in places in ways that you don't see in the letters. It's sort of the work of trying to render the fiction seems to the work of trying to write the art seems to have stretched her in ways that she sometimes loses in the letters.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree that that there's a lot in the art. I mean, that's useful, and I think you're right that you do see her wrestling with it. That's what I mean. I mean, I think she is actually a really good example of a writer that's dealing with sort of white racial terror, of like sort of recognizing the extent to which these racial imbalances are woven into the very fabric of our society, and what it would mean to sort of try to separate that. And so, I mean, I think she's very useful in sort of telling us about white people struggling with what it means to be white. Where I struggle with is people trying to say the claim that she also said something interesting about Black people, or that she's somehow sort of enlightened on interracial relationships, that she gives us something useful in that regard. And like, I think the fact that she didn't pick up any Black authors tells us the extent to which she actually cared about reaching across that divide. I mean, to me, it seems like, yes, she absolutely was struggling with what it means to be white in a racist society, but where she really fails as a writer is any sense of sort of like actually understanding Black people and what it would be like to be Black in Georgia or Alabama, or the places where she sets her stories. And I think that's just a failure. And I think it just, as like scholars, we can say like, yeah, look, this shows the way that somebody that's wrestling with really important ideas can have huge blind spots. And it's so often that these blind spots are also the blind spots that like benefit us, that allow us to sort of live in a really precarious situation where there wasn't maybe an alternative, and you have to make some sort of mental calculations that allows you to look in the backyard and see the hill house and the poverty they were living in and justify sort of your own position. And that sort of like mental work that all of us do on some level, of sort of like saying like, okay, this is how I can explain the poverty around me. This is how I can explain my position and feel my own separation from it. I think that's really important work to point out in fiction. What frustrates me is sort of the extent to which we go to try to avoid that conversation. To try to say like, no, she really was enlightened, or she really did see this clearly. When I think we have to really torture her work to find that reading. Like, there's a really obvious reading sitting on the surface, and we go, well, I don't want to read that because that's really troubling if the last story she wrote is her most racist story. And so we try to figure out a way to sort of like say, okay, how could we read this in a way that protects the image that we want to believe of this author that we're invested in? And that to me seems like a sort of dangerous track to go down.
I think, Will, I want to push back a little bit. I don't read Judgment Day as her most racist story. I'm very compelled by your rethinking of the movement from the Geranium to Judgment Day. And I entirely agree that O'Connor doesn't have much to say of the black experience of like this sort of kind of traces back to the Alice Walker reading, that she sort of keeps black characters at a distance. There's a huge blind spots and huge incompletenesses there, but it doesn't seem to me as though the reading that makes her deeply attentive to and deeply critical of the kinds of defensiveness, the lengths to which white characters go to protect themselves, the degree to which their own their bullying of their black neighbors, or their sort of the world in which they're invested in, is rendered as sin that is smashed in the course of the story, or the degree to which I don't know, I see in story after story, when she's dealing centrally with race, she is quite attentive to the white side of a hideously sinful and racist social order, and the purposes that it serves for the white character. So I agree with you that she doesn't have much to say about the experience of her black characters. But to me, that reading is pretty much on the surface.
Yeah, a
Paxton,
couple things.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I think, yeah, and a couple things. One, I think it's important that, like, we use a term like racist, and that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I think she's certainly less racist than some racist people. Like, I think there were certainly worse versions of racism out there. But what I mean when I'm going to talk about Judgment Day that way is that what it seems like by Judgment Day is that she had abandoned the idea that Black people could lead, that they were perfectly capable of taking the standard forward in the South. That instead, her Black characters in that story are deeply, deeply flawed. I mean, they are some of the worst. The dentist, the descriptions of Coleman, the Black actor on the stairs, they're cruel. They're all sort of very unsavory characters. And you can make the claim again that, like, oh, all of O'Connor's characters are unsavory, but Tanner's sympathetic. I mean, he's a doddering old man that gets, like, basically killed at the end. And so that sort of, like, positioning of the reader's sympathy to me in the time of, like, the civil rights movement seems to me like a very clear racial failing. And again, yeah, there's worse versions of racism out there. You could be more hateful. It just seems like acknowledging that, and the sad truth that, like, of course that would happen if you spent your whole life living in this place and not seeking out another perspective. And, you know, I mean, it seems very natural that when she moves out of the home for the first time and makes her first Black friend and is challenged to, you know, think more differently, she entertains the notion of a Black character capable of leading the way forward. But at some point, it seems like, you know, she abandoned that view, and that's something that I think is important for us to reckon with as scholars of her work.
Before we run out of time, I want to,
sorry.
Yeah, Nina LaVille, to ask your question. Maybe this will be a concluding mini discussion. Nina.
Yeah, so I put it in the chat, but I'm just curious how all of you would interpret the artificial in general, but particularly the scene in the train when Nelson describes the Black man on the train as a man, a fat man, and an old man before Mr. Head tells him that this was a Black man. It seems that Nelson has to learn racism, so I'm curious how you all think that this scene contributes to the discussion.
Yeah, I'll give Bill and Will a break unless you guys want to take one. You know, this is so fun. It's good to be with everybody, even though these are really difficult things to talk about. Deep disagreements based on different premises and understanding of how to approach these things. And I think that this is the kind of conversation that we should always be having in our profession. Really happy about that. So, I mean, the artificial N-word, important to note that, I mean, that was, O'Connor said that was her best story. She felt like it was her best story, the most successful one. So I always like to point that out, just when we're talking about the artificial N-word. And, you know, I think a lot of scholars read this as a kind of education about racial hierarchy and difference. I think that that's a pretty right. I mean, like that's an important facet of the story. The question is to what end that education is happening, and how should we feel about where, you know, the boy and his uncle end up at the end of the story, and how that should affect the way that race is figured in the story somehow. And so I don't know. My favorite reading of it that I've encountered so far is actually Toni Morrison's. In her book, The Origin of Others, she talks about the artificial N-word explicitly, and discusses that, you know, and I think that this gestures toward a lot of scholarship that is beginning to come out of whiteness studies, and particularly whiteness studies in O'Connor, that, you know, O'Connor, despite sort of some of the racial failings that we've talked about, was able to convey the destructive and harmful aspects of recognizing racial difference, and the fact that the nephew's being educated into a sort of life of racism. But Morrison has this phrase that I say a lot, which is O'Connor seemed to understand the theological construction of the stranger and its benefits, and how, you know, the lost characters in the Black section of Atlanta who encounter the lawn statue and have this experience toward the end. You know, that O'Connor seemed to notice that was a construction of the stranger that was beneficial, that seemed beneficial to the people experiencing it in some way. And I think Bill would say that is her, you know, demonstrating the sinful nature of that, right? That is a recognition. She's laying bare that is a, she's laying bare the problematic nature of that. And, you know, it's complicated, but I tend to sort of agree with Morrison that comes through in that story. But I don't think at the end that anybody's saved, which would put me in contrast with some other scholars at the end of that story. So I need to reread it. I missed some details, but that's kind of how I would respond to it. But I think it's important to notice that's, you know, if O'Connor is a sort of writer who has a deep and profound understanding of how whiteness operates in the South, then to what end is that awareness, and to what extent do the stories kind of bring that out? And notably, I mean, the beginning of the movie American Fiction, the recent film that's based on Percival Everett's Erasure, which was written by Cord Jefferson. I think y'all know the beginning scene, right? Where Monk, the main character, is put on sabbatical at his college because he tries to teach the artificial N-word to his American fiction students. And this is the opening scene. And the thing I appreciate about that is that I think that sometimes there's a protectionism that comes with sort of like not talking about these stories. You know, the idea that, you know, a Black scholar who has a deep understanding of race and is a creative writer wouldn't be able to teach the story to students because of its content is kind of an interesting thing that I think Cord Jefferson is kind of making fun of in his film. So anyway, that's a meandering answer to your question, but those are some thoughts about the artificial N-word.
Thank you. I am accepting papers about O'Connor and Race right up until July the 15th. Everybody can pick up on an angle about this complicated topic, and we'll just keep talking about it more and more and more. And
Interrupt real quick.
thought, Bill?
July the 15th is, I thought it was May the 15th for.
Oh, that's right. It's May the 15th.
Okay.
July is when
I didn't
have the
I
program.
didn't not get you in.
You're correcting me.
Yeah,
May the
probably.
15th. You have almost no time to get your conference proposal about race figured out. Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, man. Okay.
And I
Thank
just want to say, we didn't talk about Why Did the Heathen Rage, but that's a really important new kind of subject, source text related to all these conversations. So
All about race.
so we should have a conversation about heathen, Bruce, for one of these Zooms, but also if you're going to be at Society for the Study of Southern Literature, we have a roundtable on that book that I hope that you'll join us for. So sorry to hijack, but I just wanted to name that book because we hadn't said anything about it, and I meant to when I was talking earlier.
All right. Thank you for everything in the chat, and thank you for your presentations, and thank you for showing up, and we'll keep going. Thank you.
Thank you.